Welcome to Afra Global 24, your trusted source for breaking news, deep insights, and stories shaping Africa and the world. Stay informed, stay connected, and experience the news that matters. Right here, 24/7. Debt. It is the invisible chain that binds nations, shaping their policies, their priorities, and their power. Today, France, one of Europe's richest nations, sits on a staggering $4 trillion national debt. On paper, that figure alone is alarming. But what's more shocking is the story behind it. Because much of France's ability to sustain this massive debt is linked directly to Africa's future. Yes, Africa. For decades, France has maintained a unique, controversial, and often secretive relationship with its former colonies. A system critics call Francafrique, where African economies remain tethered to Paris through the CFA franc currency, resource contracts, and political influence. While Africa gains loans, aid, and trade, France gains something far more critical, a financial lifeline. The gold reserves, foreign currency holdings, and raw resources of African nations have, for years, acted as a hidden pillar of French economic stability. They underpin France's ability to borrow on international markets, to finance its public services, and to sustain its social model. Without Africa, France's $4 trillion debt would look far more unsustainable. But now, everything is changing. Across West and Central Africa, governments are questioning the CFA franc system. Countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger are cutting ties with Paris. Natural resource contracts, from uranium in Niger to oil in Gabon, are being renegotiated or outright canceled. For the first time in decades, Africa is seriously challenging France's hold. And that's where the story becomes explosive. Because if Africa breaks free, France's debt burden could become catastrophic. Imagine this, a European powerhouse forced to confront the reality that its financial survival depends on resources and reserves extracted from Africa. A reality where the future of Paris's debt repayments is decided not in Brussels or Berlin, but in Ouagadougou, Bamako, or Niamey. This is not speculation. Economists have long warned that France's deep reliance on African monetary reserves and trade flows is a silent vulnerability. The $4 trillion debt mountain is climbing, interest payments are rising, and political pressure within the European Union is mounting. If Africa closes the tap, the consequences for France and Europe could be dramatic. But the bigger question is, what does this mean for Africa? For generations, African nations have been told they cannot survive without France, that their currencies, their economies, and their stability depend on Paris. But now, the tables may be turning. If Africa reclaims its reserves, its gold, and its independence, it could hold the key to Europe's financial future. So what we're witnessing is more than economics. It is a historic power shift, one that could reshape not only Africa's destiny, but also the balance of power between Europe and its former colonies. In this report, we unpack the layers of this complex relationship. We look at the origins of France's debt, the hidden role of African reserves, the rising tide of African resistance, and the dangerous question now being asked: can France maintain its $4 trillion debt without Africa's support? $4 trillion. That is the size of France's national debt, a figure so vast it almost defies imagination. To put it in perspective, that's more than the entire annual GDP of Germany, the largest economy in Europe. It's nearly double the size of Africa's combined GDP, and it is money that France owes to investors, to markets, to the world. But beneath the headlines and statistics lies a story few dare to tell. France's ability to carry this staggering debt load has been propped up, in no small part, by Africa, by its resources, its currencies, and its reserves. And now, as African nations begin to break free from France's grip, the question is rising louder than ever. Can France survive its debt crisis without Africa? Let's start with the basics. France, like most modern economies, finances much of its spending through borrowing. The French state issues bonds, pays interest, and rolls over debt year after year. For decades, this system has been stable. But today, France's public debt has exploded to more than $4 trillion US dollars, roughly 112% of its GDP. Rising social spending, economic stagnation, and the costs of managing crises, from the COVID-19 pandemic to energy shocks, have all added to the burden. Each year, France pays tens of billions just in interest, and markets are beginning to question how sustainable this really is. Yet, somehow, France remains able to borrow cheaply. Investors still trust Paris. The question is, why? And the answer takes us far beyond Europe to Africa. To understand this connection, we must revisit a system born in the aftermath of colonialism, Francafrique. When African nations gained independence in the 1960s, France designed a structure to maintain control. At the heart of it was the CFA franc, a currency still used today by 14 African countries. Pegged first to the French franc and later to the euro, the CFA franc was presented as a stabilizing tool. But here's the catch. Under this system, African central banks were required to deposit up to 50% of their foreign reserves in the French treasury. This meant that France not only had influence over African monetary policy, but also had access to billions in African reserves. These reserves bolstered France's own balance sheets, helped guarantee its creditworthiness, and provided a quiet but critical pillar of support for its borrowing power. In other words, Africa's money helped France sustain its debts. Add to this the vast contracts that French companies hold across Africa in oil, uranium, gold, cocoa, and infrastructure, and the picture becomes clearer. Africa has long been the silent guarantor of French economic strength. But this system is under attack. In recent years, African nations have grown increasingly vocal in rejecting French dominance. In Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, military governments have expelled French troops and cut diplomatic ties. In Senegal and Ivory Coast, movements are rising to abandon the CFA franc. Young Africans see Francafrique not as partnership, but as exploitation. They ask, why should our reserves sit in Paris while our people struggle? Why should our gold and uranium light up French cities while our villages live in darkness? This sentiment is no longer confined to activists. Governments are acting. The West African Economic and Monetary Union is actively exploring alternatives to the CFA franc. Niger has renegotiated uranium contracts. Burkina Faso is prioritizing domestic gold refining. Each of these moves chips away at the financial cushion that France has long relied on. And as the $4 trillion debt grows, the timing could not be worse for Paris. Consider the case of Niger. For decades, French nuclear power plants, which provide 70% of the country's electricity, depended on uranium mined in Niger. Contracts were structured to heavily favor France, with Niger receiving little relative benefit. But in 2023, Niger's new military government announced a review of those contracts, demanding fairer terms. If Paris loses privileged access to Niger's uranium, it faces not only an energy challenge, but also an economic one. Cheap uranium helped keep French energy costs down and kept its industries competitive. Without it, debts become harder to manage. And uranium is just one example. From oil in Gabon to cocoa in Ivory Coast, the unraveling of France's grip on African resources threatens the very foundations of its economic model. The greatest danger for France is not one country breaking away. It is the domino effect. If one African nation successfully exits the CFA franc and builds an independent, stable currency, others will follow. If one nation redirects its reserves away from Paris, others will reconsider their deposits. This would deal a double blow. France would lose access to billions in reserves, and investors would begin asking hard questions about the true stability of French finances. Could France still borrow cheaply if it no longer had Africa's hidden support? Could it still manage its debt without the implicit guarantee of African reserves? These are questions Paris does not want the world to ask. This is not just about economics. It is about geopolitics. France is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. It presents itself as a global power. But much of that power rests on influence in Africa. If it loses Africa, France risks becoming a mid-sized European state with outsized debt, rather than a global force. Meanwhile, other powers are moving in. Russia, China, Turkey, and Gulf nations are deepening ties with African states, offering military support, infrastructure projects, and investment, often without the colonial baggage. For Africa, this creates new leverage. For France, it creates new vulnerability. And at the center of it all sits the question of debt. How does Paris keep paying its bills in a world where Africa no longer plays by its rules? So what are France's options? One path is reform. France could finally cut the colonial-era ties, treat African nations as true equals, and build partnerships based on mutual benefit. This might secure long-term cooperation and stabilize its finances. The other path is resistance, clinging to the CFA system, fighting to keep contracts, and using diplomacy or even pressure to maintain control. But this risks backlash, further alienating Africa and accelerating the very collapse Paris fears. Neither path is easy. And all the while, the $4 trillion debt grows larger. But this story is not only about France. It is about Africa's future. For decades, African leaders said independence was incomplete without economic freedom. Today, that dream feels closer than ever. By reclaiming reserves, renegotiating contracts, and asserting sovereignty, African nations are beginning to flip the script. The question is, will Africa use this leverage wisely? Will it translate defiance into real development, infrastructure, and opportunity for its people? Or will new dependencies simply replace old ones, with Russia or China playing the role once held by France? The choices made in Ouagadougou, Bamako, Dakar, and Abidjan will not only shape Africa's destiny. They may decide whether France can remain a global power or buckle under the weight of its own debt. $4 trillion. That is France's debt. But it is not just France's problem. It is tied, deeply and inseparably, to Africa. For decades, Paris relied on the continent to quietly sustain its finances. Today, that lifeline is fraying. And tomorrow, it may be severed entirely. The world is watching. In boardrooms and markets, in palaces and parliaments, the question echoes. Can France manage its future without Africa? And perhaps more importantly, what happens when Africa realizes that it holds the key, not only to its own freedom, but to the fate of Europe itself? This is more than economics. It is history unfolding. And the balance of power is shifting from Paris to Africa. Asterisk. You've been watching Afro Global 24, your window into Africa and the world. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on the latest stories shaping our continent and beyond. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a report. And join the conversation in the comments below. Until next time, this is Afro Global 24, bringing Africa closer to the globe 24 hours a day.